This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week, two just fantastic human beings, Paul Jasley.
Hello.
And Nick White.
Hey.
Thank you guys for being here with me this week. It is a brand new episode. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because we were just talking about the IRCB survey results. I'm feeling great today. I'm feeling excited. I'm ready to talk about comic books. You know, I've got a whole thing that I want to tell everybody about when I get to my whole piece of what I've been reading. But for now, let me ask the question I ask every single week, and that is, how have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Nick.
Things have been good. It's randomly like 45 degrees in Michigan. I don't know what's going on, but the snow's going to completely melt, and it's just going to be, I don't know, it's going to be gross again. Who knows? Beyond that, I actually have been doing some reading. I know everyone has been waiting with bated breath for when is Nick going to discuss new Valiant titles. I know there's like a Valiant watch clock somewhere. It's been X amount of days. You guys are going to have to go reset it, because here we go.
Oh my.
So I read The Visitor 1 and 2. This is written by Paul Levitz, drawn by MJ Kim, colors by Diego Rodriguez, and letters by Simon Boland. And look, I know for a lot of you older DC fans out there, there's probably a whole lot of love for Levitz. His run on Legion of Superheroes was a big deal. He was also the president of DC Comics from 2002 to 2009. Wow. I'm not really sure if that final point is like worthy of praise or booing. I wasn't reading DC at the time, so maybe that's not that good of an accomplishment. I don't know. But my point is, like, for me, I largely know him for his work on Dr. Fate, which he did with Sonny Liu maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it appears that, like, based on that book and based on The Visitor, that Levitz is very much obsessed with placing his books in New York City, and also has a thing for characters with weird helmets, basically.
Okay.
MJ Kim is probably best known for drawing 2018's Faith Dreamside. Now, if you're thinking, Nick, what's The Visitor about? I'm stalling for time because I'm not really sure myself. 2 issues in, here's The Visitor, okay? Guy sort of in like a all black kind of like riding like motorcycle getup with a semi sort of motorcycle helmet shows up on Earth. We're not even sure he's from Earth or not from Earth. I don't know. And there's an explosion at the Japanese consulate, and basically turns out these Japanese scientists are in town. They're working on some AI project or something. And this guy's chasing him around. They go off on the run, and he starts following them wherever they go. You know, there's not much to be said about this book. Look, I followed the Backstreet Boy line of questioning to see if I could find out, like, who this guy is, where he's from, what he did, as long as he loves me. And I really don't know that much, okay? Like, okay. It's... I don't know. Like, basically, okay, this is my best way of explaining this book. Like, someone comes to you with, like, some file, and it's marked top secret, and you're like, oh, top secret. And they're like, yeah, this is a big deal. It's a huge secret. You won't, like, you can't tell anyone about this. It's amazing. And you open it up, and it's, like, 99% redacted. And you're like, well, I'm sure there's a great story here if I had more than 3 mentions of the word "the" to work with. But that's all I've got.
Do you think that this book is going to perform better probably as a collection then? Like, as you're reading multiple issues in a row?
It absolutely has to. Like, it has no choice. As single issues, this is like they're getting off on the fact that, like, everything is cloaked in ambiguity, but, like, that's not how things work. You have to give me some morsel for me to go and start connecting the yarn lines on my corkboard with. Okay, like, right. I need a starting point. Like, I need a foundational basis to work with, and it's not giving that. There's nothing to go, ooh, I wonder about this. Beyond that, the other kind of troubling thing I'm noticing with this book is it does not seem concerned at all with linking to the larger Valiant universe. And I would basically say, based on what I've observed in the last couple months, I think DMG is not that concerned. DMG being the new majority shareholders of Valiant. I think DMG is not that concerned with having a shared universe, and I would say some of the recent activities would make me think they're actually making moves to move away from that system. And if you want any further proof, basically the fact that the Bloodshot movie is with Sony, but the Harbinger movie is going to be with Paramount, which more or less seals their fate, from what I understand, of having a shared universe cinematically. I would say that they're not that interested in having that, which is, for some people, myself included, that's unfortunate.
Interesting. How is the art on this book?
I like MJ Kim's art. I think it strikes a pretty good balance between, animated and realism. I think that I was reading some tweets over the last couple months about, I think it was Levitz talking about all of the work that went into rendering his vision of what he wanted to show of New York. And so, I mean, yes, if you were looking for a reason to finally throw away your Lonely Planet guide to New York, I guess you can do it now if you have this comic.
Good to know.
Because he's going to show you all the spots.
I see.
Beyond that, I will briefly mention I also did read British Ice, which is an original graphic novel by Owen Pomeroy, who wrote and drew it for Top Shelf Press. It's an Arctic mystery that also sort of deals with colonialism. It's got a minimalist, sort of scratchy, almost Edward Gorey-like art style. I didn't get a lot of time with it, however, because Hoopla was down for a large amount of yesterday.
That's a bummer.
So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, I wasn't sure if you were done. I don't know how far you got in the book, but we'll move on. Paul, how are you? How have comic books been?
I'm good, Mike. I'm trying something new in the year 2020. I'm taking a cue from you and actually making a spreadsheet of everything I'm reading. So it's been pretty interesting. So I've had 1 month to look at it, and it's more for me to remember when it gets to December and I can't recall what I read to make a best of the year list. That's kind of like the major reason to do it.
This is literally why I started, Mike, because I was at a point where I was like, did I read this earlier this year? Right. The last time this issue came out was in June, I think. Did I read it? Yeah. That's where I was with it. Right.
So there's that. And then it is also nice to see how my reading habits have changed. And I'm reading a lot more collections, but it's almost exclusively digital thanks to Hoopla. Mm-hmm. So it's been interesting to kind of track that stuff. Two things I've read recently that I wanted to talk about on the show. The first one is Dark Knight Returns, The Golden Child. It's the one shot that Frank Miller wrote. Raphael Grandpa did the artwork, Jordi Belair on colors, and of course John Workman on letters. This came out late last year, and initially I didn't pick it up because I really didn't like Dark Knight Returns 3 that Miller did a few years ago with Brian Azzarello. Yeah. And I really didn't like the Superman Year One book that Miller did with John Romita Jr. So I'm like, maybe I don't need Frank Miller in my life at this point, but I read some really positive reviews of this.
Hot take.
Yeah, right. I read some positive reviews of this one shot from people whose taste I really respect. So I gave it a whirl, and I'm glad I did. It's actually an incredibly fun comic. I really, really liked it. It takes place 3 years after Dark Knight Returns 3. It has the same characters in it, but instead of it being a Batman story, it's a Darkseid story. And it's Miller doing a Kirby homage, which I don't recall him really doing that often. And it's really interesting to see. Grandpa is able to do a mix of big, full-page, full-on Kirby Darkseid stuff. And then the next page would be an homage to the original Dark Knight Returns Miller's style. And the way he's able to jump between the two is really interesting. It's absolutely breathtaking at moments in terms of visual artwork. And Jordi Belair's colors, of course, just make the pages pop, in a really interesting way with that artwork. And even John Workman's letters stood out to me. I think everyone involved in this book, that's an all-star Murderer's Row lineup of creators for me, right?
Totally.
And they all bring their A game, and I'm just stunned how much I enjoyed it. I mean, there's some like ham-fisted political commentary you're getting. The main plot is that Darkseid teams up with the Joker to rig the U.S. election, but when it gets to the point where Darkseid is basically destroyed and gets reborn in outer space, you're looking at these pages like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. You know, it's just over the top, Kirby-esque in a way I don't think Miller does very often. It's really cool to see. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great to hear. I mean, I was looking up Rafael Grampa's art, and I can see why Miller would want to work with him. Like it's very reminiscent of Miller's work, but like it's very unique in the same way.
Yeah, there's a couple pages where I think Grampa's like purposely doing Miller's inking style, and then there's other pages where he's doing himself. And yeah, there's one page, and I don't want to give anything away, but there's one page where you just see Darkseid being like reborn as like a star in outer space, and it's breathtaking. It's one of the coolest images I've seen in a long time. And yeah, it's an incredibly fun comic for his so if you've given up on Miller but you're kind of curious, I think he's still got a few tricks up his sleeve. This one might be worth checking out, especially if you love Kirby. It's a pretty amazing homage to Jack there.
Very cool.
The other big surprise I read was Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, which is a 5-issue mini series from Dynamite that came out last year, but I hadn't heard of until I started seeing it on everyone's best of the year list. So it completely passed me by. It's written by Kieran Gillen, art by Casper Wingard, colors by Mary Sofo, and letters by Hassan Atsame El How. Of course, I'm butchering that last name. We'll have to add that to the pronunciation guide at some point. So, I do want to make special mention of the letters though, because this book, if you don't know, Peter Cannon Thunderbolt is one of the Charlton Comics characters that DC bought in the 80s and that Alan Moore based the Watchmen characters on, right? So it's one of the characters like Blue Beetle and The Question. Peter Cannon is basically the Ozymandias analog. And this book is it's not quite a sequel, but it is a commentary on Watchmen. It takes place after Watchmen, and it's based on an alternate reality. Peter Cannon, who finds out what Ozymandias did in Watchmen and tries to stop him. And I mentioned the letters because the first visual indication you get that it's connected to Watchmen is that the letterer does the exact same lettering style that Dave Gibbons does in Watchmen. So like when you see that lettering style, it's so identical, so idiosyncratic. It's like, oh, this is a Watchmen reference, and it gets deeper and deeper from there. Which I thought was really interesting.
This is, oh man, you're kicking my head in with this because I read this book and I was like, what the fuck is happening?
Oh, really?
And when no joke, I didn't know any of this stuff.
Oh, okay.
And hearing you say that puts the whole book in perspective. I got to reread this shit.
Right, yeah, because it's a commentary on Watchmen, but not so much the content of Watchmen, but the formalism of Watchmen. And Peter Cannon, the main character of this book, uses the formal structure of Watchmen in a really interesting way, and Kieran Gillen makes it a narrative, part of the book. The actual structure of Watchmen becomes has a narrative function in this story. And at the end of the book, you kind of realize that it's Kieran Gillen basically saying, through the Peter Cannon character, we can do something else. We've been doing this for 30 years. We can try something else with it. You know what I mean? That's literally what he says at the end of the book. So
I was just going to say, it seems like Watchmen is like the World War II of cinema.
Yeah.
Right? Where like Watchmen is that thing that no one can get away with. It happened, and for some reason, somehow all books lead back to it in some capacity.
Yeah.
Like Marvel Comics can never get away from kicking the face in of Nazis.
Right.
Like, like it's such a strange thing that like everything you pull back from a lot of comics, you go, oh shit, this was commentary on Watchmen. And like I didn't even realize it. And it's really funny.
And I think this is a really well done one. It's not heavy-handed. It's there's a meta commentary to it, but it's also a really fun superhero story, a superhero story that avoids all the obvious superhero tropes in a way. And there's a twist in like issue 4, which I think is really interesting, that I don't want to give away, where it deviates into another form of comic book storytelling, and another reference artistically, which I did not expect. But overall, it's less a sequel or a commentary on Watchmen and more the idea of like, hey, let's do something else with 9-panel grid. Let's do something else with these tools that when Moore uses them, they're very effective in Watchmen, but we can't just copy them. We have to do something else with them. And as someone that's always tried to get into Kieran Gillen and it's never clicked for me, I was really surprised how much I really liked this book.
Yeah.
It's there, like I said, it's meta commentary, but it's not heavy handed. It's a really fun story. And, I'm actually excited to go back and reread it, kind of catch all the details maybe I missed the first time.
Well, now I have to go back and reread it because I felt like this book was kind of a dud when I first read it. Now I feel like I just missed something.
I'm the dud.
Now that I think about it, I like can't even remember the details of the book because I feel like I read it in a haze or something. So I'm gonna have to go back and check that out.
This is when we just find out Mike didn't actually read this book at all.
I mean, that is a possibility. I'll have to go check my spreadsheet.
That's just it's just surprising to see something like this from a publisher that's largely known for like 29 Red Sonja covers. So which just goes to show. I mean, follow creators. A publisher can be known for lots of variant cover abuses or
well, they also published James Bond, and that's a fucking kick-ass series. It has been since Warren Ellis and Greg Pak wrote a bunch of really cool stuff in it. So Dynamite's got some things up their sleeve, I think.
Yeah, right, but you do kind of have to go of your way to find the gems, I think. So
true.
Yeah.
Well, it's just another statement or something worth pointing out that a franchise character can still result in some pretty out there stuff.
Yeah,
exactly. Totally. Well, for me, I've been alright. I've been playing so much Dungeons and Dragons. It's to the point where I had to cancel a game because I was so overwhelmed with how much I had to prepare and do and play as a character. So it's been a lot, but it's also good. I really love playing D&D. But I did manage to find some time to read some comics yesterday, which was the big thing. I should say over this last week. But the first book I want to talk about is a series that I've been backing on Kickstarter, and that actually kind of leads to a thing that I'm trying to do all throughout the month of February. And I'm actually trying to read a lot of the Kickstarter books that I've backed and maybe just never read over the last 6 years, which is kind of crazy. There are books dating back to, I think, 2015, so 5 years that I haven't read, that I've just been sitting on, which is insane. But you do things. You think Kickstarter sounds cool, and then the book gets delivered 2 years later, and you go, "Oh, right, I forgot I have that." But Skies of Fire is a series that I started backing in 2017 when they put out the 1 through 4 Kickstarter that they were doing, and I thought it was a limited series. And I remember reading the first issue and was like, "Oh, that's cool," and then I never read the rest. And so issue number 6 just recently was delivered or something. I think I got an update about it recently saying, "Oh, number 7's coming out. Make sure you read 6 because it's the penultimate issue. Number 7 will be." So I decided to read through 1 through 6. This is by Vincenzo Ferrerio and Ray Chow with art by Pablo Papino and Brian Valenza. Like I said, I've been backing this for a while, and the series is gorgeous and super suspenseful. The story is a fantasy world where things are kind of modernized, and I won't say steampunk because it's not really steampunk, but there are Zeppelins. People, they travel using Zeppelins, and it's more of a military / pirate style sense of travel where there's this industrial age style of living, but it feels like the open seas of pirates. And so we get this really interesting kind of clash between our main character, who is this officer who works for the government, who has to team up with a former pirate in order to go find this one pirate that killed a bunch of people. And the art in this book, I cannot express how beautiful it is. It is some of the coolest Zeppelin art I've ever seen, but more there's just a lot of really well done action, and I think a lot of the characters are very unique, and every single page is so detailed. It's worth the wait between issues because you can tell that these guys are killing themselves to keep the quality of this book so high. It blows my mind. I have a postcard of all of the various Zeppelin models that I got as part of the backing the Kickstarter, and I got that at a convention when I met the guys a few years back, and it's just beautiful. And that ended up being a 2-page spread in the back of one of the issues as backup art. And holy crap, this book is beautiful. You don't really have to be into steampunk Zeppelins and all this stuff to dig this book. I think if you like a good action, a good action story about people like trying to catch someone, trying to find this villain, and they end up in a place where they shouldn't be, I think you'll really dig this book. It is beautiful. All of the characters are very well defined. You fall in love with each of them as the issues go on, as it kind of focuses on one person for a little bit more than they did on the previous issues. And so by issue 6, like, I want this team of good guys to catch the bad guy, and then a big twist happens in issue 6, and I think 7 and 8 are going to be a fantastic way to round out this series. So if you can, check this out. Skies of Fire number 1 through 6 are out. Kickstarter for number 7 is coming pretty soon. And I think if you back the issue number 7, you can get all previous 6 issues as part of your, backing on Kickstarter, which is really cool.
Is it possible to get this book outside of Kickstarter, or where does someone go who's interested in that? Sometimes I'm always confused about, how that works.
I don't know. I'm gonna guess that I think they have a website where you can maybe buy this. I don't think it's on Comixology or anything like that. But it's, I think it's, it is on Comixology. I'm sorry. So you can go buy this on Comixology right now. Issues 1 through 4 are on Comixology, so you have to wait a little bit to get 5 and 6 and stuff. But I'm guessing because they're an independent creator, it just kind of takes some time for them to get things up on Comixology. I know that that's a thing that happens sometimes. So check it out. I think if you like issue 1, you're going to love the rest of it. It's a beautiful book. Like, the art will floor you, and then the story is actually very good as well. Otherwise, I also read a book that was sent to me via email. Matt Canning sent me an email. He wanted me to check out his book, Honeymoon in the Afterlife. And it's a black and white story that has no dialogue, and it's about ghosts in an afterlife. It's an interesting story. It's 55 pages long. There's no dialogue, so you kind of have to take a lot of it's heavily interpreted. It's based on what you want. It captured some really strong emotional moments. And in the world of this comic, everyone's a ghost, and the story seems to blend between multiple stories at once with very little transition. But they're all connected together through symbols and some carried over character quirks that you get, like, this person is moving from here to here. But all the ghosts are drawn the same. They look like your standard cartoon ghost, like a sheet over the head of a person, just kind of floating. But, they interact with things. There are these symbols that get you into different places of the world. Some of it wasn't clear to me. I will say that, like I said, there was some ambiguity in the comic that at times that kind of left me a little confused, and I had to maybe go back and reread a few pages. So, because not having dialogue, it's hard to connect some things sometimes. So I read this through about twice just to make sure that I understood the whole thing. And the one thing I will say that really worked for this book is there were very clear feelings throughout this book. You get these strangely strong emotions from these very simply drawn ghosts. It's happiness, sadness, feelings of loneliness, bonding, love. But there's this sense of dread hanging over everything. Everyone is dead, I think. I mean, and I say I think because there's the end of this book does something that changes the nature of the entire story. From what you think you're reading to where the end goes. And I was really impressed with the way that, this black and white book ended up using color. And in my head, as I was reading it, like, this splash of color hits the page, and it triggered this weird symphony of change and music in my mind. Like, there was clearly something different happening because obviously color was introduced, but the way that it was used, I thought was just beautiful. And then, so the story ends on a very interesting beat. I don't want to spoil it. I think there's a huge question that kind of ends the book. And I think for a book like this that is super ambiguous to begin with, ending with an ambiguous question seems like a bad idea. But I actually really liked it. So for 55 pages, this is a really cool, interesting read. I don't know if Matt's selling this book or anything out there, but his name is Matt Canning. The book is called Honeymoon in the Afterlife. So if you want to check it out, I would just say Google this guy. I'll put the name of this book and stuff in the show notes. If I find a link, I'll put that in there as well.
That sounds interesting. I will have to track that down.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's a really cool little book. But yeah, I guess let's move on. Let's talk about comic books that are coming out this upcoming week. Comics are dropping on February 5th, 2020. What are you guys excited for this week? Paul, let's start with you.
Let me start with a confession. I am about 6 issues behind on Justice League. But
How
I'm going
dare
to.
you?
I know. I'm going to pick Justice League number 40 with that big caveat, because issue 40 of Justice League introduces a new creative team. And again, my my backlog of unread issues has nothing to do with the quality of the Scott Snyder current Justice League run. Just the fact that I haven't managed to miss an issue in there, so I have to go track it down and then get caught up. But
Gotcha.
I really have liked Scott Snyder's Justice League. It's big, over the top. It's one of those books it's a great Justice League story. At the same time, it manages to kind of rewrite the entire history of the DC Comics universe. It's a big thing. So part of me wants maybe not necessarily smaller scale, but more traditional type of focused superhero heroics in my Justice League books. So the new creative team jumping out with issue 40 is Robert Venditti with Doug Mahnke on pencils. I think that's a pretty solid creative team, and looks like the first story arc they're doing is about a group of genetically modified supermen being led by the Eradicator who attack Earth. That's my jam. I mean, that sounds like the kind of stuff I would read. That's the kind of stuff that Justice League should be fighting. So Justice League is one of those books that I think should be DC's flagship team book, and for a long periods of time it kind of flounders, and I think right now they got a little momentum going, and this new team has a lot to live up to, and I think they can pull it off. So I'm excited to see what they do.
Yeah, that Robert Venditti and Doug Mahnke. That's like a Valiant team, right?
Sounds
Nick,
like
is that a Valiant team?
Venditti wrote Exo Man of War for a long time, but I believe Carrie Nord was the artist, not Mahnke.
Okay, never. I just knew Venditti's name. I knew he was heavily associated with Valiant at one point.
That's correct. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Nick, what about you? What are you excited for this week?
So for me, it's probably got to be Predator Hunters 3, number 1. For those who need clarification, this is the third iteration of the Predator Hunters series and the first issue of that series. It's not exactly a big brain book. I mean, maybe I'll be shocked. Maybe this will be the book that thoroughly, deconstructs the 9-panel grid better than anything else. I'm probably gonna go out on a limb and say no. But you never know. Basically, the whole premise of this franchise, if you want to call it that, is, hey, what if instead of getting murdered on a massive scale by predators, people banded together and went after predators to catch a predator, if you will?
This sounds like it's going to work out well for them.
But I'm not a huge Predator fan. I'll just say that. Like, Predator for me is like when you go to the store because you want goldfish, right? And they don't have goldfish, but they have like the store brand knockoff, which is like whales, and you're like, well, the whales don't come in multiple colors and they're not flavor blasted, but I guess these will do. And I guess
we're talking about snacks here.
I mean, I gotta stay. You write what you know, right? And for me, that's junk food. So in that analogy, aliens are the real goldfish. I want goldfish. I want aliens. Predator is okay.
Okay.
And then the goldfish that also have the pretzel goldfish, that's AVP, because it's like, it's not everything I want, but it's all right. Look,
brother,
people are like, what does this book have going for it? And that's fair. I get that. The number 1 issue has a variant cover which glows in the dark. I'm all about that dumbness, so that's good. Secondly, on a slightly more serious note, the art is being drawn by Brian Thies, and I guess I should have had credits there. Written by Chris Warner, art by Brian Thies, colors by Wes DeZobia. Thies drew all of the Aliens Life and Death series, all 17 issues of it, from several years ago when Dan Abnett was writing that. So in that sense, that's something I'm interested in. Probably going to read it in trade. It looks like they're actually discontinuing the ongoing story and starting something fresh compared to the first 2 arcs, but we'll see. Beyond that, I will say there are 2 other really strong contenders for Book of the Week from Yen Press, which I came across while I was on Fresh Comics looking at this week's books. So one of them is titled, no joke, quote, I am Behemoth of the S-rank monster, but I am mistaken as a cat, and I live as... I'm sorry, let me make sure I get this right, because I'm adding words. Quote, I am Behemoth of the S-rank monster, but I am mistaken as a cat, and I live a pet of Elf Girl. Volume 1. That's a book.
Okay. Yep.
There's another one with a slightly smaller title called After School Bitchcraft, Volume 1, which...
Listen, people read books, okay? They're all different types out there.
Yeah.
And, you know, we say this all the time. If you have an interest, there's a comic for you. And I think someone out there, these comics are for them. That's all that it is.
These could be good. I mean, honestly, that first one with a title like that, I almost feel like they've actually described everything that's going to happen, but maybe not.
Yeah,
they might have left something out.
If the book title is that descriptive, you know that the story has to be either massively complex or so simple you know exactly what you're getting into, right? Yeah. Like that's insane. I can't believe that's a thing. We're moving on though, because I'm going to talk about what book that I'm excited for this week, and I'm going to check out this new book from John Layman and Carl Molstert called "The Man Who Effed Up Time." This is I don't know what this is really. It's a sci-fi action comedy from Layman, and I'm okay with that. And this is a brand new artist just making his way in the scene, so I'll give it a shot. I don't know what this could possibly be about, but obviously there's going to be time travel and some goofiness, so I am on board at least to try number 1. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, I'm always willing to try a John Layman book, despite some of the rumblings we've talked about elsewhere, where with him. But I'm always willing to try. The other book that I was going to mention was I kind of want to pick up X-Men / Fantastic Four number 1. Chip Zdarsky's writing this, and for some reason I have constantly just been avoiding reading Chip Zdarsky's Marvel books. Not for any particular reason. I just don't read them. I don't know what it is. For some reason, I expect it. I'm worried that it can't be as good as some of the other stuff that he's read, so I know that I'm just going to be disappointed. But right. I've only heard stupendous things about all the work that he's done at Marvel. But the one reason why I'm hesitant about this book in particular is because I never really understood why crossover titles between the X-Men and Fantastic Four ever happen. It's like mixing oil and water to me. Like they just don't go together. Science and not science shouldn't go hand in hand like this. And not to even say that the Fantastic Four are even remotely scientific, right? Because it's all science magic, but it feels like they're two different types of stories that really don't clash well. But I don't know. Someone out there prove me wrong. I don't know.
Wasn't there's that whole scene in House of X where like the Fantastic Four show up when they're setting up Krakoa? I don't remember the details, but they've been setting this up for a while, I think. So,
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, not to say that it doesn't make sense in continuity. I just feel like the types of stories that they tell in those books don't mix well. Mm-hmm. And
you just hate Franklin. You hate Franklin.
I just hate Franklin Richards, and I think by saying that, he's going to come kill me in the grand multiverse of all things, right? Because he's like uber super overpowerful. I know that he's a mutant,
right?
Like that's the whole big thing is that he's a super mutant, and like so the X-Men were like, whenever you want, kid, just come over and you can live at our house. And he's like, but I want to live with my real mom and dad.
We have HBO.
And, yeah, Professor X is like, yeah, we have HBO, and like. You're 13 now. We'll turn a blind eye if you want to turn on Cinemax after 11. So I don't know. Maybe that's what the book's going to be about. Chip Zdarsky's writing it, right? He only writes comedy books, right, guys?
Right.
I know that he doesn't because I read the first issue of Spider-Man: The Life and Times, and it was very good. And I picked up the rest. I just have yet to read them. But anyways, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about director's cut comics and annotated comics, and what the hell does that even mean? Why do these books even exist? A question we're constantly asking here on I Read Comic Books. So we'll be back in a second. Before we start our show this week, I want to remind people, I should say inform people, maybe for those of you that don't know, we started a new series on Patreon called The Saga of Saga, and it is a massive endeavor that myself, Brian, Kate, and Kara are digging into. We are going through every single issue of the series Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples, and we're talking about every single issue by issue in little small bursts of 8 to 10 minutes. So if you are a Patreon supporter or $5 tier and above, you'll get into this. You're getting 2 episodes a week. It is the most fun we've had recording a show. We're going to go through every single episode. We're going to talk about every arc of the story, how it all plays out together. So if you haven't read Saga and you want to, now's the time. Listen to that after you've read the series. It's going to be a great thing. You could read along and read it. We don't spoil too many things outside of the issue that we're talking about. It's going to be a lot of fun. So make sure you head over to patreon.com/IRCB podcast and check that out. We've got a whole bunch of stuff coming out on Patreon this year, guys. It's going to be insane, but I had to plug it. I'm so excited for this. It started last week Friday, and it's going to be going until we're done with the series. So get ready for a ton of awesome content on our Patreon. But anyways, we're here to talk about this week annotations in comics, annotations for comics, and director's cut comics. What does that mean? Why do we read them? Do we even like this stuff?
What's
comics? The point of it? What's the point of it? No, I'm genuinely curious because I think that every once in a while we'll see like a digital version or even a physical edition of like a director's cut comic, or we'll hear about something like the Annotated Watchmen. What does that even mean? And is that something that you're interested in as someone who's maybe read these comic books before, these reissues of comics that have already come out, but with more information to some capacity? So I'm going to, toss it over to you, Paul and Nick. What do you guys think about this stuff?
This topic came to mind when I saw that they had re-released Immortal Hulk #1 as a director's cut. And my initial reaction was like, yeah, I love that book unconditionally, but there's no way I'm going to rebuy it, no matter how much they repackage it, in that format. Right. And which is kind of a shame because I really like Al Ewing's writing, and it'd be interesting to get some process notes and some insight from him. But the idea of going back and rebuying something just to get that felt unnecessary in a day and age when a lot of that stuff gets thrown in the back of trade collections. You know what I mean? Yeah. The idea of the director's cut of a comic coming out is not appealing. On the other hand, when that stuff is collected in a trade paperback, when you see the character design sketches or maybe some pages of a script, I love that process stuff. So on one hand, I like that stuff, but it's a hard sell to rebuy a single issue just to get it.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that I noticed that with like House of X, I think it was, like the first issue, if you bought it digitally like I did, you automatically got the director's cut, but it was $7 or $6 or something. Okay. And then like 2 weeks later, they released the regular #1 for $4. And I was like, you sons of bitches. Yeah. You got me. And like, I remember reading through that and I was just like, holy shit, this is 140 pages long. And I know they've done that with a couple different X books. And it was just, it's so long and there's so much content. And I think that stuff is really cool. It's just, sometimes it's a little unnecessary, especially to get thwarted as the #1 digitally. Like, what a bunch of garbage. Yeah. But, I don't know. What do you guys take away from those kinds of books? I mean, Nick, maybe I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, director's cut issues are a little weird, and I sort of diagrammed for myself kind of, they seem to largely populate two different categories, I guess I would say. And the first would be usually when a flagship book launches a #1 or a big event rolls around the corner, usually for DC or Marvel, they'll launch a director's cut, usually directly at the exact same time that the first issue launches. Or in the case you described, if they're being real shady, they'll actually launch it ahead of the much more affordable normal version of the issue. And yeah, I don't see a lot of mileage for those. I guess if you're a big fan, go ahead and get it. I guess maybe in their line of thought, it's the idea that we better at least launch it now because at least people will buy the $6 issue first and be happy, as opposed to, as Paul was describing, you already got $4 from me. You're not going to get another $6, right? So,
right.
And I don't know. It's just, I mean, it's definitely a collector's thing, right? Because why would you be like, oh, I love this book so much and I haven't even read it that I want to own the script, or I want to own the raw pencils. Like, you haven't even read the original book yet, right? So, although I guess I should say sometimes a director's cut just gives you like the black and white pencils, and of course other times you get some pages of black and white pencils along with the original colored artwork or whatever. So, that can happen in different ways. So that's like sort of category 1 of director's cut for me. And then the second one is whoops, a book that we didn't think was going to be this big of a deal turned out to be a real big deal. We want to try to make money off of this. And, that could be either, as Paul said earlier, the Hulk book, whichever one, Immortal Hulk, or Tom King's Vision, where they, went back a year later and said, we're going to take each, we're going to release, so Tom King's run was 12 issues. We're going to release a 6-issue run, each of which is going to contain 2 issues of Tom King's original run with extra content. And that is exactly the sort of reason why I think, centuries from now, when people are trying to, understand, our art and our culture and everything, and they're trying to parse together how in the world comic books worked, they're not going to bother figuring it out completely. They're just going to be like, fuck it. Fuck it. So this book is labeled number 1, but it's actually number 1 and number 2 of a book that came out last year, and now it's being re-released. Yep, that's right.
I mean, Nick, we already have that problem if you look back 15 years, right? Like someone who wasn't reading, for instance, Marvel at the time, trying to look back and say, okay, which order of Avengers do I read? Because there's 7 volume 1s in 10 years. Where do I start? And it's interesting because I think a lot of times Marvel tries to do that and DC tries to do that to just kind of contain runs and stuff like that, but it does get ultimately very confusing. I mean, these package things, I think there's a lot more details in them now than there were maybe 15 years ago, where it's very clear on the front of Vision director's cut that it contains 2 issues and a bunch of other stuff. I mean, it's basically just a reissue with more information, which is funny because they actually did print editions of these, but I think a lot of these the director's cuts that we see now from Marvel, they only come out as digital because who wants to buy a 140-page number 1 that's got a bunch of script in the back, Yeah.
Well, it's so goofy to me because when I'm talking about re-releases of singles, like the Vision thing, for example, I don't know who's really going to buy that because it's not a collector's item, right? Well, the collector's item would be having the Vision number 1 from the original run, not this director's cut one.
I think the people that are buying it are probably people that didn't buy the number 1, buy the single issues when it came out in the first place, and they prefer to have those single issues. That's my guess.
Why aren't you buying the collector's edition trade then?
I don't know. Because the collector's edition trade is $75.
Oh, right. Now I'm sorry. Yeah. We're now talking about the category called Marvel Trades. I totally forgot that's a totally
you gotta remember
bad place. Never mind.
Yeah. Marvel thinks that if they add 6 pages of extra content, they can charge you somehow an extra $20 on top of the single issues added together. And I say that as someone who has 2 of those hardcovers sitting on his shelf right now because I didn't buy the Vision in single issues when it came out. I bought the hardcover, and I'm pretty sure it was $70. I did that with X-Men Legacy that's all about Legion, and I'm pretty sure that was $100 trade, and it's maybe not even 400 pages. It's crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy, guys. Crazy. Hardcovers are insane.
That's interesting because as my spreadsheet has borne out that I've been keeping track of it, I read singles exclusively in physical edition, and I read trades almost exclusively digitally, right? So the idea of rebuying a single issue doesn't make any sense, but if I could get that content digitally in the trade, that's more appealing, right?
Right. I mean, but is that always the case though? Because I think some of the times, and maybe this is the marketing side of things to say, we want people to buy more copies of this stuff.
Right.
Maybe they don't throw all that extra content in the trade. And I know we've talked about this hundreds of times on the show to say, to wait for the trade with the extra content. Yeah. I think in some of these cases, unless they're going to do a director's cut collected edition, you might not get that in the collection.
There's a difference between that stuff. The reason I like getting Criminal and physical issues, single issues, is because I know I'm going to get that stuff, the backup essays and material stuff I really like. That's not going to be in the collection.
Exactly. There are certain writers that say you're not going to get this stuff in the trade. Yeah. Full stop.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of what we're talking about with the director's cut, with that type of bonus material, that's very rarely a selling point for me. When it shows up in the back of the collection, it's a nice treat, but I'm not going out of my way to buy something just because it has a few pages of script notes of the script at the end. Does that make sense? Right. Even though I'm someone who really likes to see that process, that's rarely the reason I would buy a book, just to see it.
Yeah. I mean, Nick, you've got some notes in here in our doc that basically, you go over some books that I didn't even know had director's cuts, like Gideon Falls #1, Black Hammer. I realize the ones that you've listed are all Jeff Lemire books, as you say, but it's interesting to know that Image and Dark Horse and stuff were putting that out. I mean, do you think that's a push from Jeff Lemire, or is it something to just kind of like bolster the sales of these books?
That's a great question. I think part of the argument or discussion would have to revolve around, were those director's cuts launched at the same time as the original #1s or down the line? I think in terms of Black Hammer, and I'm almost 100% certain in terms of Gideon Falls, that both of them were released after the fact.
Oh yeah, much later in the case of Gideon Falls.
Which for me is slightly more respectable, because you're not cashing in on sort of a feel of missing out, a feeling of missing out like people do when you launch it at the same time as the normal version of the book, and people go, oh, is this going to be more of a collector's item? Oh, what am I missing in here, right? So this idea of just putting it out a year later and saying, look, by now you've probably already read the normal book. You know exactly what you're getting into. This is for a very small crowd, but understandably probably one that actually, is an audience that's very much engaged. I'm more on board with that. I don't think it's as shady of a, business offering.
Okay. I mean, I'm looking at the Gideon Falls director's cut, for instance. Like, that came out after issue 6 dropped of Gideon Falls, and the description is, it says, after selling out multiple print runs, Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino's smash hit thriller Gideon Falls gets a special edition of its explosive first issue in glorious black and white. Also collecting the first issue script, this, quote, director's cut is a must-have for fans of one of 2018's hottest new series. So I think that they're trying to sell it as a collector's item, because, and if you look at the preview pages, like on Comixology, it's in black and white with the exception of the letters, which are in like a color, which I think is really cool. But this is essentially just a black and white edition of the book. With no colors, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. Well, for me, it definitely had interest because Andrea Sorrentino's pencils in this book are, for me, a pretty interesting departure from stuff that I'd seen with Green Arrow or what little I'd seen of Old Man Logan, because it's a lot sketchier. Like, there's like the shading seems different than in the past. And so for me to actually have the color work stripped away and be able to see exactly what was going on, for me, there was value in that.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, I do own that.
It
will accrue value. It must.
It strikes me that as we're doing this conversation, I realize that the term director's cut is very different in this context than we use when we talk about movies. Because the idea of a film, the director's cut is including the scenes that the director was forced to cut, or there were changes, things that they didn't include that, substantially changed the experience of watching the movie. If you're just reading a comic and all of a sudden, like, after it's done, there's just the script pages without the art, that's not the same thing, right?
Yeah, it's more like you've entered into the special features section of a DVD.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And there's certain...
All I'm saying is release the JJ cut. Okay?
Oh, no.
I'm just kidding. Sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say,
just making friends everywhere.
There are certain examples of that stuff where I think it's really interesting. My collected edition of Arkham Asylum has Grant Morrison's original script at the back, which is that book I think is really interesting because the art is so expressive and open to interpretation, and the story is what's the word I'm looking for? It's esoteric. In a way that is open to a lot of individual interpretation. So to have Morrison's actual, like, here's what I wrote and this is the end result, to compare the two is really interesting. But on the flip side, when I read Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, this collection that I mentioned earlier, the back of the digital collection I had Gillen's like original proposal issue by issue breakdown. Here's what the issue is going to cover, blah, blah. And I got bored to tears reading that. Cause I'm like, well, I literally just read that in the comic book version, which is more exciting. So, you know, it depends on the creator and it depends on your engagement with the original work, how much of that process you want to see, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree with you. Director's cut, that was like a point that I wanted to make as well. These are not director's cuts.
Right.
God, I would love to see the idea of a comic that was cut down and then drawn, and then somebody higher up in, you know, Warner Brothers, you know, whatever, is just like, you know, cut those pages out. Like, and then we got to see those pages. That would be fucking insane. Like, there's truly a director's cut of Batman the Damned #1 that has the dick in it. That's the only edition of a director's cut that truly exists out there, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, and I'd love to know if there are more out there. Like, we're covering a very small number of books here, and I think mostly to talk about the higher level idea of, do we like these? Do we think that there's value in them? And it sounds to me like there's kind of a consensus of maybe not. Like, this isn't a huge thing that we're going out of our way to look for.
Right.
But I do think that there's merit in some of it sometimes, to see like pencils without colors, or to see, you know, how a script compares directly to a book. And you do get that sometimes in the back of regular issues, but to have a whole, like, maybe back and forth of an extra 80 pages of a single issue comic where you get to see panel, or you get to see the script right next to the panels that were laid out. That's pretty cool stuff. But are you going to spend extra money on that? Probably not. Are you going to buy a second copy of a single issue comic just for that? Maybe not.
Yeah.
The other thing that I did want to talk about in this episode was annotated comics, if only because I didn't really think that this was something that existed, and it turns out there's a handful of these out there. Specifically, the ones that I was able to find was Annotated Watchmen and Annotated Marvels. And I don't want to say that Marvels is like DC's Watchmen, but like it kind of is sometimes, in terms of like, everyone points back to Marvels to say, if you want to understand the history of Marvel, you should read this. Sure.
And if you were dumb enough to stick around after the guy said, if you want to understand the history of Marvel, like, you deserve whatever comes your way at that point. Right. Like, you should have left the room.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Like, the Annotated Marvels came out last year. And I don't think this was Marvel trying to react to DC by any means. I'm making that comparison just because it kind of clicks in my head weirdly. But like, Annotated Watchmen would be something, if only because that book has, and it continues to be a book that we have to unpack forever and ever, and will never stop. It's just what we were talking about in the first half of the show. For some reason, we always bring everything back to Watchmen because it was a pivotal thing that happened in comics, yada, yada, yada. We don't have to go into that.
Now rip it off the pedestal, Mike. Do it. Do it.
Yeah.
No. And I'm not here to make that commentary, but what I think is interesting is that an annotated version of this book exists, and I think that buying that would almost be worth it to a certain extent, to just get all of the shit that people have unpacked over the years kind of collected together and signed off by DC, to say this is what this book was about. And I mean, we all know that maybe the relationship between Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons and DC isn't great, but that being said, like, to get an annotated version of this book would be interesting, just to see all of the stuff that could be unpacked from this, based off of the script and based off of stuff that maybe Alan Moore said in the past or Dave Gibbons said in the past, because there are other versions of this book, like Watchmen Noir, that exists where it's all black and white, or Watchmen Companion, which I think is a book that goes alongside the comic, and maybe you read it page to page or something. I don't know. It came out in 1990, which I didn't know that was a thing until just now, but even still, like, going through the annotated version of this, I'm sure would be an even longer sitting than just reading fucking Watchmen itself.
Well, I think,
but yeah, are you guys interested in something like that? Are annotation books like this interesting to you?
What's interesting is that I love reading fan annotations that people do for issues, but the idea of buying another volume of a book I already have to get the quote unquote official annotations doesn't seem as appealing to me. Does that make sense?
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, Watchmen is a book that there's a lot of literary allusions that if you aren't aware of them, they might go over your head, or, you know, you might miss. So having those annotations might help in that regard. You can see, like, oh, this is why this is a reference to X. This is, you know, why Alan Moore put this in here. Like, that's all interesting. If you didn't know the connection between the Watchmen characters and the Charlton Comics characters, there's no reason to know that to affect the story, but that would be an interesting annotation. But I think that's all stuff you can glean from essays and fan written annotations that are probably more insightful than in, you know, whatever DC put out as a money grab. So,
I mean, I'm looking through the preview of this annotated Watchmen, and it is something. Like, it is like 8-point font next to every single thing, breaking down stuff panel by panel with references to stuff like Blue Beetle and all the various things. It is a lot.
Yeah, let's make reading comics feel like a chore or feel like doing homework, you know?
One thing I do want to point out is, like, they're on page 10 right now, panel 4. Dan observes that the door lock is broken. Like, that's one of the annotations. Like,
what?
I didn't get that from the
Is this
comic.
like when the idiot goes on to Genius, you know, to talk about the lyrics of a song and just, like, basically repeats exactly what the song does, and it's like, this is not analysis.
When Drake says, I was running in the streets, what he meant was that he was putting his feet to pavement and moving forward using momentum.
Exactly. Oh, my God.
But yeah, no, Paul, I think your idea of fan annotations is something that's interesting, because as I was kind of doing some, brief research for the show, I try to do research for the show sometimes. Guys, I promise. I did come across a couple different sites, like Comics Alliance. They used to do this like 4 or 5 years ago, and like regular posts about annotations of various comics, which I think is really interesting.
And let me tell you, as someone who was reading Grant Morrison's Batman and Multiversity at the time, that was part of my experience. I would read the issue, and then I would go to Comics Alliance to read David Uzumeri's annotations of that issue with the book in front of me. Like, that was part of the experience. Just like, not that those books were too complex to understand, but again, it's that sense of, it's almost like you're getting someone else's viewpoint of it, you know? Mm-hmm. And David Uzumeri, who's writing those annotations, he would notice stuff that I would miss, or he'd have a reference to a DC universe history that I didn't know that well. So it wasn't essential to me understanding the comic, but it was expanded my understanding of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It was
totally.
That was definitely a part of my enjoyment of Grant Morrison's Multiversity, was reading annotations along with it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've been looking at another site that's apparently still doing these things, is Multiversity Comics, and going through some of their history of the breakdowns that they've done. Like Wicked and Divine is a big one, Doomsday Clock is a big one, and those are books that I think both deserve annotations, because there's so much to unpack with those books. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of other stuff, the Fantastic Four, Harrow County. There was another Hellboy that I saw, and Doctor Doom. I think it's really interesting that people are going out of their way to write these long articles to kind of break down a book, and it's not going to be page by page, panel by panel, because they can't print that stuff. But it is curious to see that folks are still publishing that stuff, and I think that there's probably a fan base out there for them to say, like, exactly what Paul was saying. You finish an issue, and then you go to this site to see what their breakdown was in case you missed something. And I think if you're dedicated to a book, that's great.
I heavily relied on the House to Astonish podcast. They have a blog where they were just breaking down all of the House of X Powers of 10 issues. And again, it was like page by page. And as someone that had never read a lot of X-Men, that helped me understand those books a lot. And again, I enjoyed the books on their own. It wasn't that it was too complex for me to understand, but that added a level of my enjoyment to it, being able to say, like, oh, that's who that character is, and that's their relationship, which I didn't know before. That's why it's strained. So that stuff is very helpful. And like you said, there's a lot more out there than maybe we even realize of people doing that.
Yeah, I found some random fan site. I don't know what it is. When I searched for comic book annotations, it was like one of the first sites that came up, and it's like they go. It's called in Jorla's World. Mm-hmm. I don't know anything about this, and it looks like they just go through DC and Alan Moore's books and just break everything down. As I'm clicking through, like, there's just, it's weird alternate universe timeline breakdowns on issue by issue, page by page breakdowns, just as straight text files. Like, it's it's such a weird site. I mean, but it's
like a GeoCities page.
Yeah, it kind of looks like it. Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't really find any other examples of this other than the Marvels and the Watchmen one, because I don't think that there's actually like a huge need for it.
Exactly.
Right? Because a lot of the times comic books are pretty straightforward, and a lot of the times I think authors, when they write complex books, actually release their own version of annotations. Mm-hmm. And I say this from, experience with reading like Warren Ellis's newsletter or Kieran Gillen's blog or his newsletter. Like, I know for the longest time Kieran Gillen was writing down like 5,000 to 10,000 word breakdowns of each individual issue of Wicked and Divine, and that is insane, but like no need for anybody else to do that. Kieran's got it covered.
Right.
So if you needed to have a deep breakdown, I mean, those blog posts still exist out there. I think Matt Fraction did that for a while, and a couple of other writers have done that over the years. Which is cool. I mean, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, find a creator's newsletter. The chances are they have one. Every big creator out there has got one these days, I think. And yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. There's not a lot of annotations out there, so I realize that's kind of the weaker side of this discussion. But it's something that I think we've talked about many times on the show before, that a lot of comics are really straightforward about how they're explaining things to you. And even when you need to look for deeper meanings and themes, like we've talked about in another episode, a lot of those times it's just you kind of take a step back and just reevaluate your comics. Like apparently I read Peter Cannon the wrong way, and so I need to go back and read it. So, I mean, I totally get it, but it is just a matter of maybe taking a step back from your books and not just reading them for the face value content, and instead saying, like, is there actually a bigger thing going on here?
Yeah. Yeah, and as I mentioned, there are certain creators and certain books that I enjoy reading the annotations or finding fan annotations, because I think it is a thing where that shared experience of, if I don't have someone to talk about the book with, this is a good way to do it. I can get another view of the book and some deeper insight, and if nothing else, it doesn't point to the book being too complex or me not understanding it. It actually deepens my understanding, right? So I think definitely I'd be curious to see, someone that does have a big X-Men background to go read those annotations about Hoxpox. Maybe there's something in there that you missed, even though you've read everything, having another viewpoint might expand your understanding and enjoyment of that book.
Oh, yeah. My brain only has so much capacity, and so a lot of the times I remember X-Men stuff, and then I remember it wrong, or someone goes, Mike, actually, no, and on page 43 of volume 2 of Grant Morrison's X-Men run, you actually see that Kid Omega punches Beak in the face, and that's why they don't like each other. I'm like, oh, okay. I don't know, man.
And also,
no one's actually done that to me. I just
it's also nice, too, because I think there's a weird sort of overwhelming sense. If you're trying to read X-Men and you've never read it before, it's pretty daunting, So instead of going to Wikipedia and reading a summary, to get annotations to the book you're reading or trying to get through is a much easier and more enjoyable way to do that than trying to absorb, 30 years worth of history from a summary,
Yeah.
So.
This is how I feel about Justice League. I think every time I read Justice League, I feel overwhelmed in that I don't know who this character is or why they're talking, or like I read Jeff Johns' JSA and kind of just rolled with 95% of the punches.
Yeah.
Because I was just like, who the fuck are these? There's
Blue
90
Superman.
characters in this book. That's Superman, but it's not Superman?
Right.
Why is that girl called Star Girl, but she looks like she's a Supergirl? I mean, it was an interesting book. But you got to just roll with the punches, as we always say when it comes to big 2 books. But I mean, I would love like annotated breakdowns of some stuff, especially if you're like, here's like a quick Wikipedia breakdown that you need to get into this book. That would be really cool to see if some site out there has done that. Say, okay, so you want to read X, and then they give you everything to get you up to speed on that thing. I think that would be really cool. Maybe that's something we should do. No, that's too much. That's too much. But yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have any final thoughts on this, Nick? I realize we've just kind of been barreling over you for a little bit.
Oh, no, that's fine. I mean, one thing I would say is that I think there are some other books with annotations that I do enjoy, but I think with some of those, it's just more a pure necessity that they exist, and I'm just happy that they're there. I mean, one good example would be Alan Moore's From Hell with art by Eddie Campbell, I believe. And I mean, the amount of annotations is insane, and it makes sense because when you realize the sheer amount of work that went into that book, it's just blinding. I don't know what the best way of doing annotations is. Honestly, the whole side by side with an 8-point font, like it's like a editor's markup, basically. Like, I don't dig that. I think you should leave the original work uncluttered. Which is what happens with the annotations in From Hell, but that does mean that you're constantly like, I have 2 bookmarks in From Hell right now. Okay. I have one where I am in the book, and I have one in the annotation section in the back of the book, so I can keep flipping back and forth whenever I need to. But it's enriching stuff. It's thoroughly interesting because, especially with something like From Hell, you've got a book which is a weaving together, right, of historical fact with fiction. And so with something like that, at least for me, it's fascinating to know where Moore is completely making things up or completely inventing characters, and where he's actually pulling from some book on Jack the Ripper or another book on Jack the Ripper, and sort of where where the connective tissues exist between his imagination and the things he's reading. So,
I think when it comes to books that are based on quote unquote reality, right? Like Jack the Ripper at this point is high fantasy, but it's still like when you look at stuff like, especially, around like serial killers and stuff like that, when there are comics about that, seeing the sources in the back, or like Durf Backdurf's, My Friend Dahmer, like the back of that book is just full of breakdowns. And I found that mesmerizing. The second time we read through it, I was like, I'm going to read through this whole thing. And next thing I knew, it was 3 a.m. And as I'm going through these, 8-point font breakdowns as he goes page by page, explaining where he pulled different things that he put into the book is mesmerizing. But I think that works better for, like I said, books that are based on, real life, versus maybe fiction, where there's maybe not as much ambiguity because it's fiction, Right.
I mean, it seems like this stuff really exists in two camps, one of which is books that veer into nonfiction subjects where you need, in as much as you want insight, you also want author accountability, right? In terms of how they're operating. And then the other camp is just books that have some insane amount of clout, or as Paul was getting at, obviously, books with a large amount of depth or things that you can get into. So that's why, that I don't know if you guys have seen that insane version of Sandman, but it's just, I mean, good God.
The leather-bound editions or what?
Aren't the isn't there? Maybe I'm confusing the fact that there's an annotated Sandman with just Ultimate Sandman, and that's you've seen those? They're like $100.
There's so many versions of Sandman. It makes me sick to my stomach.
Guys, let's talk about how Sandman's overrated. We're we have a few minutes here at the end of the. I'm just kidding.
Guys, we've got to wrap up the show right now. But really, I mean, I think that we said a lot about this. I'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts on if they read annotated versions of books, or if they know of any other examples that really worked for them, especially when it comes to fiction books versus nonfiction. Because I think, Nick, you made a great point. Like nonfiction books, that's maybe a whole different category that we didn't even get into today. And I think there's more to be said about that, like just about nonfiction books in general. But I think it'd be great to hear if folks have other examples out there. So make sure to email us or tweet at us and stuff. And so here's where I'm going to wrap up the show, because I'm not getting into how Sandman's overrated right now. So you can follow us all on Twitter. You can follow Nick at Death Star Plans. You can follow Paul at Oh Hi Paulie. You can follow me at Mike Rappin, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. I promise I try to post things when I can.
Much like Superman is powered by our yellow sun, we are powered by fans like you on Patreon. You can find our Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. You can join and sign up for access to exclusive audio, articles, IRCB schedule updates, and top of my pile posts, and much, much more.
Our Goodreads group is a lovely community of comic friends. You can join our yearly reading challenge, which just recently started on February 1st. And you're welcome to comment on our weekly threads. This week's thread was our Book of the Month discussion about Saga Volume 1. You can check all of this out over at ircbpodcast.com/Goodreads.
Be sure to check out ircbpodcast.com for our comic book creator pronunciation guide, which we'll need to update soon, our Discord server, zines, our merchandise, and much, much more. Everything you could possibly want related to I Read Comic Books.
And if you haven't already, please rate the show 5 stars and give us a written review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever. A simple rating seriously helps us and helps bring new listeners to the show.
You can email us with anything you have to give us with what you've been reading, recipes, corrections, questions, anything else. Send those to ircbpodcast@gmail.com.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music for our show, and they also do the music for our Saga of Saga series. Make sure you check that out on Patreon. Xander is a high wizard of the grandest kind, great high fiver, and honestly, if he knows you well enough, he'll give you a real nice hug. I want to say thank you to him for editing the show. Thank you to Paul and Nick for being on this episode. And thank you to listeners out there and all the folks over on our Discord. I love hanging out and chatting with you guys. I can't wait for our next hangout on February 21st. Make sure you're on the Discord. It's happening. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you. And that is the show.
Boom.
Yeah, it just rolls into Sandman being overrated. That would be great. Good God.
I mean, that's
Paul, how
that's a
much
whole-
of that have you read?
Zero.
Out of sheer curiosity.
None. Zero.
Yeah.
It's
Interesting.
the biggest
Okay.
gaping hole in my... but it's all in Hoopla, so one of these days I'm going to... Maybe this summer, that'll be
know.
my project.
That's a thing. I've read Volume 1 probably 4 times.
Yeah.
And every time I finish Volume 1, I go, why would I ever keep going?
I mean...
And I know, like, there are so many people who love that book, and they all tell me, Mike, if you just get past Volume 1, if you just do what everybody else
If you
says
just
about
watch
every...
seasons 1
if you
and
just
2
watch
and 3, you'll find out in season
Listen,
4 it's actually
by
a
the
really
time you-
good show.
By the time you get Season 4 of Supernatural, it all just starts coming together. Yeah, no, and I get it. And I really should, like, at some point sit down and read it. It's one of those books that's just, it's monumental, and the hype is so big, it's going to let me down regardless, so I might as well get it over with. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
Maybe I'll finally understand why people like Neil Gaiman.
I definitely understand people who go like, I can't look at art from that time, right? And I mean, I hate to say it, but Sandman is not the best looking book ever.
Sure.
Obviously that's why it got recolored completely. And then, as we've talked about before, it's just a weird book because, like, if you think it's like Morpheus centric, like after volume 3, it like stops being Morpheus centric until like volume 8 again.
Right. I mean, he's got a whole family of people, right? He's the Sandman,
the
and his
family's
sister's
cool.
death.
What are they called?
And his
There's a name for all of them.
brother's a living house or something, and somebody lives in the moon. There's a cow jumps over a spoon or something, right?
The Dreaming. That's it, right?
The
Isn't
Dreaming.
that what they're called?
I don't know.